Welcome to the first chapter of the course. I think that it is a good idea to start by taking a slight step back before we fully start on the topic of this module. So here we see the many systems that make us, an organism that functions as all these systems work together. As a side note, quite interestingly, the only system that we can live without is the reproductive system. All others are essential and we absolutely need. If you think about it, somehow all these systems must be coordinated so that they can work together. For example, skeletal muscles, which we need to be able to move around and respond to our environment and achieve the things we want to achieve. Well, these muscles need to attach to bones. Remember the concept of muscles typically running over a joint in order to generate a movement of that joint. So one cannot achieve its function without another, right? But then again, to be able to perform their job, which is, to put it very simply, to contract, so that a movement can be generated. These skeletal muscles need energy, nutrients, oxygen, and so on. So to enable this, we must have a way to transport these to the skeletal muscle tissues. And for this purpose, we use blood as a transport media. So again, we need this another system to help this one to make its job. In this case, the cardiovascular system. But we must get these nutrients and energy to the blood somehow. Well, for that, we have digestive system, right? Without it, the skeletal system does not get the resources that it needs to function its job. But wait, there's more. We also need to get oxygen to the skeletal muscles and to get rid of carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of cellular metabolism, where glucose from food is turned into ATP that drives the muscle's job. So we also need to have respiratory system added to this. But when you exercise, for example, and your muscles work hard, as a byproduct, you will generate heat. And to avoid overheating, your integumentary system steps in. You might, for example, start to sweat to reduce the heat and avoid overheating. So another system linked to this, right? And don't forget that some of the blood may be escaping the cardiovascular system as an interstitial fluid. And as it enters the lymphatic system, it becomes lymph. And of course, we remember that lymphatic system plays an important role as one of our body defense systems. And we remember that as a byproduct of metabolism, we had excess carbon dioxide and water. So this carbonic acid is something that we need to deal with. And while bicarb is eliminated by a respiratory system, we have excess hydrogen. And we use urinary system to get rid of this. So, are you starting to see a pattern here? Every system is dependent on other systems. They are all interlinked. But all this needs to be controlled somehow. And to do this, we have two body control systems. Nervous system, which you learned about at the end of last A&P course. And we also have endocrine system, which we will look into more detail on this chapter. To compare and contrast these, let's think of both a little bit. While nervous system is fast in its responses, remember the quickly progressing action potentials that were the basis of nerve impulses. And the messages in the nervous system last only a short time. Remember, it was all about detecting changes, while otherwise we got used to continuous signals. In comparison, endocrine system, which we will be looking in this chapter, it is slower to act. It takes a longer time to achieve its goal via hormones. But the hormones remain in the body for a longer time, so the effects of endocrine system are generally long-lasting. And of course we have sometimes, or actually quite often, interaction between these two body control systems. Say, as an example, epilepsy is a result of uncontrolled firing of action potentials in the brain, and this then spreads from its original location throughout the brain and can often result in seizures. But we can use pharmacological interventions, drugs, essentially action on the hormonal level, to stop this or at least to control this. So there is a lot of overlap here. We will focus on the endocrine system on this chapter, as I said earlier. The field that studies hormones and their actions and the organs that make and respond to these hormones is known as endocrinology. I have listed here some important functions of endocrine system. As you can see, it is a large range of things and affects pretty much everything from becoming mature to reproduce and playing role in the reproductive processes, female menstrual cycle, pregnancy and giving birth, to growth. Remember that the growth spurt in teens is driven by hormones. And then of course, the maintenance processes. We remember from our earlier studies that all this, maintaining consistent internal environment, is of course known as homeostasis. The reason why I'm highlighting this is that this is so essential for our survival. And of course we had some others like cell metabolism. Remember, getting the energy to live. Basal metabolic rate being the amount of energy needed just to maintain essential functions for just being. And we have, of course, a greater need if we do activities. And finally, also acting on things. For example, protective functions. The next thing that I want to remind you briefly about as part of our introduction to the endocrine system, if you wish, is the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands. Just to be sure that we are clear of this. Remember, exocrine glands have a duct of some sort, and the gland opens outside itself. This may be outside the body like sweat glands or tear gland or salivary glands, or opening inside the body like glands responsible of the stomach secretions. So they really act locally. Endocrine glands instead release their secretions to the blood. They do not have a duct like exocrine glands that we saw earlier. And these were, of course, hormones that get secreted here. Some examples that I can think of would be Pituitary Gland, Pineal Gland, Thyroid Gland, Adrenal Gland, testes, and ovaries. These all act throughout the body. This is important for endocrine glands. Their secretions reach all parts of our body. At this point, I also want to mention pancreas, because it's kind of an interesting one. Which one do you think that it is? Endocrine or exocrine gland? Well, turns out that it is one of the few glands that serve both as an exocrine and endocrine gland. In a role of an exocrine gland, it produces the most complete digestive juice, which gets released via duct to the first part of small intestines, duodenum. And as an endocrine gland, it plays an important role in blood sugar regulation. Here is a great diagram. You will find it with this video in the blackboard, if you wish to download or print it for yourself. This picture shows the endocrine glands in one view. We will go through all of these, so it's a nice review sheet which you can fill in more details as you wish. So here you can see these endocrine glands labeled. Let's go through each of these very briefly, one by one, as a review. Let's start with the important endocrine structures in the brain. First, the pineal gland. It produces melatonin, which is of course responsible for regulating our sleep-wake cycle. Next, we have hypothalamus and pituitary gland. I have included here a rough diagram showing the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Hypothalamus has a large number of functions, but to summarize these, it is really responsible for controlling things. It is often controlled through neural impulses, and its job includes controlling also pituitary gland. So hypothalamus acts through pituitary, and pituitary gland has a range of functions. For example, it in turn controls adrenal gland, and this was the flight or fight response, and it releases steroid and cortisol. These were stress hormones. It also regulates the growth hormone. This plays an important role, especially in the puberty. We also have here thyroid gland. This is important in controlling metabolic rate. Some clinical conditions arise from when this gland is over or underactive. Next, I want to mention thymus. This plays an important role in the immune system, being the site where T cells are made, hence its name. What is quite interesting about thymus is that when we dissect an adult catheter, we cannot always find it there. This is because it shrinks over age. Remember, I also mentioned that pituitary gland regulated adrenal gland. Well, adrenal gland is located on top of the kidney and is responsible for the sympathetic branch response of autonomic nervous system. This is the fight or flight response. We also have here kidneys. Let's look at their role as an endocrine gland. When we talk about kidneys and fields that deal with them, we typically talk about renal fields. So a kidney doctor is specialized in renal medicine. So what is the most important function of the kidneys? What do you think? Students often say that it is all about being an organ behind urination, making urine. And while this is true, it has perhaps even more important role in filtering blood and regulating blood pressure. This is true renin. And another important hormone that is related to this organ would be erythropoietin, and controlling red blood cell production in red bone marrow. I briefly mentioned pancreas earlier. It was the interesting gland that was both exocrine, producing pancreatic juice, which played a key role in digesting food, and being also endocrine gland. And the role as an endocrine gland is the one that we are interested in this context. It produces insulin, which has all to do with the blood sugar regulation. Okay, the last ones that I want to introduce, these are ovaries and testes. They are responsible for producing sex hormones. So they control, for example, secondary sex characteristics, making reproduction possible as an individual matures, and control menstrual cycle in the woman. And it is because of this cyclic nature of hormones that control menstrual cycle that this has some significant effects on the pharmacological trials, for example. In fact, I used to work in the pharmaceutical field and have some good stories to share from that. Have you wondered why it is typically always males who are included in the earliest stages of testing a new drug in humans? Is it because we are so easily replaced, or just silly enough to sign up to try a new drug while women are smarter? No, that is not the case. So, here is what happens in a development of a new drug. We do lab work, and once we are satisfied that the new drug will work, then it's time for animal experiments. And once we are satisfied with that, it is time to try the drug in a human. For this stage, we typically always choose males as the test subjects, even if it was a drug mainly aimed for females. Why? Well, it comes to this female hormonal balance variation during menstrual cycle throughout the month. That is why it is easier to start with males, as our hormone levels are typically more stable, so there are less possible variables to consider at these early stages of pharmacological trial. As the very last thing that I want to mention in this video, I want to remind you of a few terms that you should be familiar with from your earlier BIO181 or BIO156 class. These terms are shown here. So chemical messengers of the endocrine system can be either hormones, which travel in blood to all parts of the body. These are the interest of ours in this chapter. Autocrines, these act on the cells that secrete it. Or paracrines, which act somewhat locally within a few cells distance. Like I said, these should be familiar terms for your prereq classes. And because autocrines and paracrines are local chemical messengers, they are not technically considered as part of the endocrine system, so we won't spend time on these. So, that's it for this first video of endocrine system. I hope that it has gotten you interested to learn more as we move further study this topic in the next few items on your learning module. I will see you there.